Well, hi there, folks. I trust that you're all doing well at the moment and that God continues to bless you. I want to look just now with you just at a psalm together. I want to consider with you Psalm chapter 27 or Psalm 27. And I want to take the time just to read the whole psalm with you. It is one of my favourite psalms, if I'm allowed to have a favourite. And so let's just have a wee look through it and consider it together today. So Psalm 27, and we're going to read from verse 1 of this psalm together. Psalm 27 then, verse 1. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When the wicked, even mine enemies and my foes, came upon me to eat my flesh, they stumbled and fell. Though an host should encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war should rise against me, in this will I be confident. One thing have I desired of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. For in the time of trouble he shall hide me in his pavilion. In the secret of his tabernacle shall he hide me. He shall set me upon a rock. And now shall mine head be lifted up above mine enemies round about me. Therefore will I offer in his tabernacle sacrifices of joy. I will sing, yea, I will sing praises unto the Lord. Hear, O Lord, when I cry with my voice. Have mercy also upon me and answer me. When thou saidst, seek ye my face, my heart said unto thee, thy face, Lord, will I seek. Hide not thy face far from me. Put not thy servant away in anger. Thou hast been my help. Leave me not, neither forsake me, O God of my salvation. When my father and my mother forsake me, then the Lord will take me up. Teach me thy way, O Lord, and lead me in a plain path because of mine enemies. Deliver me not over unto the will of mine enemies, for false witnesses are risen up against me, and such as breathe out cruelty. I had fainted, unless I had believed to see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait in the Lord. Be of good courage, and he shall strengthen thine heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord. And we look to God to bless the reading of his word today and to give us help as we consider something from this psalm today that might just be perhaps an encouragement to us today. So we come to the Psalms, the general poetry book of the Bible, as it were. And we come to, I suppose, the first book of the Psalms being split into 5 different books. The Genesis book running from Psalm 1 to Psalm 41, and then the Exodus book from 42 to 72. Then from 73 to 89, we see the Leviticus book. 90 to 106 takes us through the Numbers book, and Psalm 107 to the end to Psalm 150, we see the Deuteronomy book of the Psalms. And so we see the Pentateuch of the Bible brought out across the Psalms, but today we're going to look specifically at Psalm 27, a psalm that is in that Genesis book of the Psalms. And the Genesis book of the Psalms really is all concerning man, where the Exodus book is concerning Israel and so on. The Genesis book concerns man. In Psalm 1, we see something of man's blessedness. And of course it starts, doesn't it? Blessed is the man. But then we see from Psalm 2 to Psalm 8, man as fallen. And we read phrases like this, why do the heathens rage? But then when we come to Psalm 9 through to Psalm 15, we see man's enmity against God. And there contained within those Psalms, we have that Psalm 14, the fool has said in his heart, no God, no God. But then we come to Psalm 16 and through to Psalm 41, we see something of man's recovery through Christ. And in the very next Psalm that from which we've read, Psalm 28, we read these words, unto thee will I cry, O Lord. And so we see something of man's recovery through Christ. And Psalm 27 sits within that section of the Psalms. And The title that is given really is a very brief title, just a Psalm of David. There's no other title that's given here, a Psalm of David. And, most of the Psalms would be ascribed to David. 73 specifically are, and perhaps of those anonymous Psalms, of which there are 50, perhaps another 20 or so could possibly be David's Psalms there as well. And so it is a Psalm of David. We don't know when it was written and the circumstances. Some of the Psalms would tell us that in the title. This Psalm does not tell us that. And so really it is unknown, possibly. It was prior to him being king, or perhaps it is that he looks back on his life in old age and reflects on the goodness of God, and he considers something of that. But it seems to me that what is on his mind here is that he's being pursued by enemies. And so it may just be that it is at that time when, Saul was pursuing him before he became king of Israel. We see him being pursued by his enemies in verse 2 and in verse 3, again in verse 6, verse 11, and down in verse 12. And so each of these verses before the psalmist David is that he is being pursued by his enemies. And, I rather think there is a relevance for us today within that, isn't there? Often we are so conscious of the enemies that are round about us today. In the circumstances of our own life, whether personally or whether corporately, we do feel the enemy round about us so often. And so perhaps there is a relevance for us today as we come to look at this psalm. So as we look at the structure of the psalm, and just to give a little outline, from verse 1 to verse 6, we see something of rejoicing confidence. And here there is praise. Here there is thanksgiving from the psalmist for God. From verse 1 to 3, within that section, we see something of the confidence that the psalmist has in God, confidence in God. And then verse 4 to verse 6, we see his communion with God, as he has a desire. One thing, he says, have I desired of the Lord, that will I seek after. And so from verse 1 through to verse 6, we have rejoicing confidence. But then from verse 7 through to verse 12, we have a revealed concern. And here, from a section that has been all about praise and about thanksgiving, we see something of a stark contrast in these verses of weeping and of prayer in these verses, something of an earnest with the psalmist in these particular verses. And then moving from that second section of revealed concern, we see he comes back at the end of the psalm in the remainder of the verses, the final two verses, verse 13 and verse 14, we see now his renewed confidence. And we see him back to faith again in those verses at the end of the psalm, and rejoicing again. And often that might be our experience in the trials of life. And we see that in many of the psalms, actually, the ups and downs in the psalms. And we have those ups and downs in our lives as well. And so there is that rejoicing confidence. Then there's that revealed concern that he has. And then there's that renewed confidence that he comes back to at the end of the psalm. So let's look through the verses of the psalm together, and really taking it from the outset there in that section of rejoicing confidence. And we do see from the very outset of the psalm that he has confidence in God. As there, the very first line that we read, the Lord is my light. The Lord is my light. It's interesting because David himself was known as the light of Israel. If we were to look at 2 Samuel, where we see something of the account of David's life, there in 2 Samuel and chapter 21, let me read verse 17 of 2 Samuel chapter 21 to you, or part of that verse. And we're kind of halfway through the verse, and it says, Then the men of David swear unto him, saying, Thou shalt go no more out with us to battle, that thou quench not the light of Israel. And so David was seen as the light of Israel. And here the men that are with David there, the desire is that he doesn't go to battle, lest that he would lose his life, lest that the light of Israel would go out. And so David is known as the light of Israel. And yet David, I suppose, and perhaps maybe even in this phrase at the outset of the psalm, recognizes that his light, I suppose, is similar to the light of our moon. And we see the light of the moon so brightly at times on a clear night, and yet it is a light that is borrowed from the sun, isn't it? It merely is a reflection of the sun. And that really is David, isn't it? The light of Israel, a reflection of the Lord, who is truly his light. Now, I came across a modern Christian song recently, and it talked about being the moon. And I couldn't quite understand it at first until I realized that actually it was about being able as Christians to reflect something of God and his glory, to reflect something of the Lord Jesus Christ in the way in which we live our life. And that's a wonderful occupation for us as well. And David was really just the light of Israel, a reflection of the Lord who truly is the light. And of course, light itself speaks to us, doesn't it, of comfort. You know, in a dark night, it's nice to be able to see the lights, isn't it? To see the light of the town, to see the comfort and the coziness of light in the distance, and to aim for that light. Light brings comfort in the darkness. But light not only brings comfort, but light brings conviction. Conviction of sin comes through the light being shone and exposing the sin. And the Lord, as light, shows our imperfections through his perfection. The Lord is my light. But of course, he doesn't leave us there. He goes on to say, and he is also my salvation. The Lord is my light and my salvation. And so in exposing the sin that the Lord would do in his perfect life, he then offers a remedy for sin in the form of salvation from our sin. The Lord is my light and the Lord is my salvation. Not only gives the light, not only gives the salvation, but indeed is the very source of it as well. And knowing this fact, the psalmist goes on to say, whom shall I fear? And it's really a rhetorical question, isn't it? And the answer is there. There is nothing to fear. From the powers of darkness, he is the light. From the damnation of hell, he is my salvation. What an encouragement to start the psalm with. And as if that is not encouragement enough to start the psalm, David goes on to say in the second couplet here of this verse, the Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? The Lord is the strength of my life. And David here, he makes it personal. He says, he's my light. He's my salvation. He's the strength of my life. And, you know, I think we can apply that to ourselves as Christians today as well. A promise that we can take personally if we are trusting in the Lord, that he is my light, my salvation, and the strength of my life. And because of this, David has further confidence that there is nothing to be afraid of. And so he can affirm at the end of verse 1, of whom shall I be afraid? And as David begins now to look to the future, he takes that confidence from having proved his Lord, as he now reflects on the past deliverances that he has known. And he states there in verse 2 that the wicked, although there were many of them and they were varied, they all had one common purpose toward him, united in coming against him, desiring to do all in their power to hurt him. And yet they stumbled and they fell. You know, let's maybe just stop there and apply that to ourselves again. You know, is this not really so up to date for us today? You know, there are so many forces in the world today that are very different to each other, and perhaps at loggerheads with each other. And yet it seems that when it comes to moving against Christian things, that they're united against us. You know, I was looking recently for another study at the book of Nehemiah. And you come to chapter 2 when Nehemiah has gone to Jerusalem, and he has gone with the letters from the king. And we see those enemies, Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem at the end of chapter 2. And it seems to me that these would be very different individuals with different outlooks and different focuses and different motivations, different agendas. But when it comes to Nehemiah, they seem to be united against him. They're united against him. And that's often the same in the Christian experience as well. And that was the experience that David had felt here as well. And he goes on to describe the actions of these enemies that come against him in verse 2. He says they come to eat up my flesh. It's almost as if they were cannibals here. True beasts that are against him. And maybe David is likening some of these past experiences with people to his previous experiences with the lion and the bear as he would tend for the sheep. And he views these folks as the very same. And yet he says, despite how they came against me to eat up my flesh, they stumbled and they fell. They stumbled and fell. Not as a result of David's doing, but really they failed in their purpose. And perhaps as well within this, he's maybe thinking back to that experience with Goliath, if indeed he is looking back here, one that came up against him, and yet, by the help of God, to David, Goliath was one who stumbled and fell. And we see that in the life of Christ as well, don't we? As we consider the experience of Christ himself, his enemies came against him. And even, as they would come to the garden to take him at the end of his earthly ministry, at the announcement of who he was, I am he. They stumbled and they fell. They moved backwards and they were down in worship before him on that occasion. The enemies of Christ. And as followers of the Lord Jesus Christ, we can expect to have enemies against us, yet we can take comfort and confidence from the experiences of David had, and the testament that he that is in us is greater than he that is in the world. Regardless of the forces that are round about us in the world, he that is in us is greater than he that is in the world. And so David comes now and he moves not so much to the attack of the enemy, but rather to the suspense of the potential battle in verse 3 as he considers being surrounded by the enemy. In Psalm 3, he talked about 10,000 being round about him. And often the anticipation of what might happen is worse than the actual attack, isn't it? And that really is David's experience here. As he recounts that situation and he says, even in that situation, my heart shall not fear, he says in verse 3. And even if war should rise against me, in this will I be confident. What is it he can be confident in? Well, it's through the experiences he's had in previous verses that we spoke about. And so his confidence comes not only from the knowledge and belief of the power of God, but even more rather from having experienced that power in his own life in the past. And we can claim that same confidence in the knowledge of the God who is on our side, but also as we can ourselves look back on experiences that we have passed through, we can see something of God's hand in it all, and it brings us confidence in God. But then he moves to verse 4 and communion with God. And we see here at the outset of this verse that David has a fixed desire on one thing. Split aims would surely spell failure and defeat. No man can serve two masters. But here, David has an undivided, unwavering attention, and that is commendable to have an undivided, unwavering attention, and that, is a wonderful thing, but the subject is as important, isn't it? And he has one desire, but for that desire to be of the Lord, that truly is the rightful target for our desire. God judges us by the desires of our hearts. Our motives are as the deed, and so I wonder, what is our goal in life? What is our one desire? Is it toward the Lord? Or are our affections misplaced? Well, David's desire was to the Lord, and David, having fixed his desire, he sought after him. What was his desire? Was it that the wars may be over? No, but rather that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. There are two reasons that are given here that he might be in the house of the Lord, that his desire was to be in the house of the Lord. First of all, to meditate upon the beauties of his God. This is an occupation that we too should be involved in. In a future day, that will be our eternal occupation, won't it? I wonder, do we long for that future day? And I wonder, whilst here upon this earth, do we desire to be in his presence and to meditate upon something of God's glorious excellency. How often it is that life, legitimate things in life, can distract us away from that desire. And so I wonder, as I question myself, is my desire strong enough to meditate something upon the beauties of the Lord? And so that was his first reason that he wished to be in the house of the Lord, to meditate upon the beauties of his God. But secondly, it was that he might inquire in his temple. You know, we also should be concerned with God's will is for our lives. And it really is only through being in the presence of God that we can get to know what that is, what that will is for our lives. Mind you, if we're going to seek that will, we must be prepared to carry it out. And so David inquires in his temple, seeks the will of God, and within it all, he recognizes that he needs to keep in the presence and in the will of God. For it is when he keeps in the presence and in the will of God, verse 5, that in the time of trouble, he shall hide me in his pavilion. You know, in the army camp, the royal pavilion was the king's tent. And that would be situated right in the centre of the camp, the king's tent. And that would be a place of safety with other tents round about it and the guards keeping watch on it all the time. It would be the very safest place in the time of trouble there in that scene in the camp. And really, that is what is before David, I think, in his mind here. In the time of trouble, he shall hide me in the safest place of the camp. When war comes against me, the safest place to be is there with God. And he goes on to say, in the secret of his tabernacle shall he hide me. And it's not so much that David is hiding himself, but rather that he is conscious of the sovereign watching over him and hiding him safely. God was taking care of his servant. You know, the tabernacle or the temple was often used for hiding. Indeed, even in more modern history, we see that that people for refuge would seek refuge in church or whatever. And so it was back then that in the tabernacle, in the temple, in the place of God, no one dared enter into that holy place for fear of death. And so in the tabernacle, God hides him. And that really is how safe David felt in that circumstance. You know, if we, as we apply it to ourselves, live a life of service and sacrifice to God, seeking his will for our lives and abiding in his presence, then we can surely feel that same protection, succor, and comfort when trials come our way. And as well as feeling that safeness and that security, David is conscious here at the end of verse 5 of steadfastness, as he states, he shall set me upon a rock. And we can hardly say that without being reminded of Psalm 40, when there David says, I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined unto me, and he heard my cry, and he brought me up out of a horrible pit, out of the miry clay, and of course he set my feet upon a rock. It's a solid rock that can never be shaken. What confidence, therefore, that we can sing, on Christ, the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. And in having considered this, David now sees himself lifted up above his enemies round about him in verse 6. And the idea here is that he is placed out of reach of his enemies and lifted up in honour. You know, David now doesn't seem to see the earthly enemy as a problem anymore, for he has the God of Israel with him and truly has something to be overjoyed about. And so therefore he says, I will offer in his tabernacle sacrifices of joy. In sorrow, he sought that tabernacle, and now in joy he comes back to that place, having had his plea and his prayer answered, and he bursts into song, and he praises God in the most natural mode of joyous expression here. You know, it's true, isn't it, that we can have that confidence in God as well. A confidence that he can hear and that he will answer our prayers. How good it is, though, to be able to come back into his presence and to give him thanks. We shouldn't be lifted up in vain glory, but rather should give all the glory back to God when he has heard and answered our prayers. How often maybe we can get caught up in the victorious situation, and yet, as this psalm demonstrates, it's so important for us to constantly remain on our guard. For it is at these times that the devil seems to strike. It's often after our highest mountaintop experiences that we're brought down into the lowest valley. We see that in the experience of many of God's people through our Bible, that it was at times when perhaps they had known their greatest victory, yet they fell so very far after that because they started to rely on their own strength. And so we must never rely on our own strength. And David knew that in his experience. And I believe that this psalm is a demonstration of that, as it now turns in stark contrast from a praising of God to a prayer to God. And notice here how the Lord changes from being the third person to the second here as he now begins to address the Lord in prayer from verse 7. And we see there are three things that David appeals for. He says, "Hear, O Lord, when I cry with my voice." Then he goes on to say, "Have mercy also upon me." And then thirdly, he says, "Answer me." David's now crying to God, concerned that God would hear his prayer. The Pharisees in the temple were concerned that men would hear their prayers. But David's prayer is genuine. And the ear of God is of the utmost importance to him. Commentators suggest here that perhaps this was a private prayer of David's, and yet David is using his voice. And I think that sort of somehow suggests something of the earnest with which David was praying. There is no doubt that it does help to concentrate the mind when we pray out loud, doesn't it? I know that in my own experience, when at times it's hard to pray, to actually vocalize the words really can help even in the private place. And so the psalmist, he vocalizes his prayer here. "Hear my cry, hear, O Lord, when I cry with my voice." He says, "Have mercy on me." This is the hope of the sinner and the refuge of the saints, isn't it? Mercy from God, holding back what we truly deserve. "Have mercy on me and answer me," he says. He's anticipating an answer. He's anxious for an answer. And, we can apply all of this to ourselves, that God would hear our prayer, that it is Godward rather than manward, that he would show us mercy as we confess our sins to him, and that we would have that expectation that he would answer our prayers, and that we would not rest until we have that answer. True it is it not, as James would tell us, the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. And David now, as he has longed for that answer, he hears the answer now. "Seek ye my face," is the answer. And he's willing to accept the command of God as he responds in verse 8, "Thy face, Lord, will I seek." And we notice something of the speed and the willingness to which David responds to the will of God. And having a desire for God to hear our voice, we should also too be willing to listen to his voice of reply, sensitive to the voice of God, and speedy to respond to it. As David here responds and makes it personal. The command of God was to seek ye my face, and that really is expressed in the plural, seek ye my face. But David takes it to himself personally as he says, "Thy face, Lord, will I seek." And so as we hear an answer from God in our experience too, we ought to take that personally for ourselves, not to think about others who might benefit from it, but rather if we are to grow as Christians, we ought to take it to ourselves and learn of it. And so David now, he seeks the face of the Lord, and he pleads on the basis that if God has asked him to seek his face, then in verse 9, he will not hide his face from him. How dreadful it would be to discover that God has hidden his face from us. That really, I suppose, is what we deserve in a natural state. And David acknowledges that and pleads, "Put not thy servant away in anger." He's conscious here of faults in his own life, perhaps looking back to what has happened in his own life. And perhaps maybe thinking about when Saul was put away from God, and he prays that he may not be judged in the same way. But David acknowledges to God that "thou hast been my help" in verse 9. But he's aware that past blessing has not sufficed for the future, and he prays to God that he might never leave him or forsake him. Sometimes we might feel unworthy to come into the very presence of God, for we can fail him so often, and God would be quite righteous to put us away in anger at times. Yet this should not keep us away from getting before God. Indeed, that's the very time when we need to be before God, confessing our sin before him, pleading for mercy, for truly we can lay hold upon our salvation as David did, and be confident of his promise that he will never leave us or forsake us. And this seems to be a turning point in David's experience here, as he acknowledges that even when my father and my mother would forsake me, God never would. Perhaps the most understanding, sympathetic, forgiving relationship that we could ever have on this earth is that of a parent to a child. And yet, even if that fails, says the psalmist here, then the Lord will take me up. God's love surpasses the most tender parental love. He loved us without a cause. He demonstrated his love by sending his son, the Lord Jesus, into the world to die for us. And being reminded here, as the psalmist is, of what God has done for him, he has a desire and a willingness to obey the will of God and to be led in his ways. As in verse 11, he says, lead me in a plain path, a flat and honest and upright, a just path. David desired just to have a simple life of obedience and to be honest in his dealings because of mine enemies. Enemies. Those that would observe, those that would look on. David here is conscious that there were those who hated him. There were those who were just watching for him to do something wrong that they might capitalize on it. We read in 1 Samuel, there in chapter 18, when the folks have been talking about how Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. There in that day, we read there in 1 Samuel 18 and verse 9, Saul eyed David that day, from that day and forward. Saul's eye was on David. There were those that were enemies that were looking out to see if they could catch him out. And it's the same for us in our experience as Christians. We need to be careful how we act, particularly in positions of authority. That all our dealings are as Christians ought to act. There are many who would love to bring to our attention the things that we do wrong. And the devil can use that type of circumstance to ruin a testimony and to seek to undermine God himself. Remember who we represent on earth and the responsibility that brings. And so David says in verse 12, deliver me not over unto the will of mine enemies. In keeping in the will and the path of God, David desired to be kept from the will of his oppressors. He says, false witnesses are risen up against me. Even if David dealt honestly, he was conscious that there were those that would falsely accuse him. We see that in the experience of others in the Bible, like Daniel, for example. Such as breathe out cruelty, says David at the end of verse 12. Their very breath, their very existence was to hate good and to hate him. And I think we maybe see something there again of the experience of the Lord Jesus Christ as we think of his false accusers, and yet God does not allow that we be delivered unto the will of our enemies. Whilst Christ was delivered over to the hand of the enemy, he was never delivered over to their will. It was ever the will of God that Christ would go to the cross and sacrifice himself for us, and ultimately would be exalted in heaven. That was the will of God, and Christ was always in the will of God, never in the will of the enemy. And so we come to the final two verses of our psalm together. And with renewed confidence, at the end of his prayer, we see a change in which he addresses the Lord again. He's no longer addressing him in person here. David realizes that he would never have been able to withstand all that he had come through if he had not, by faith, seen God in all of it. He says, I had fainted unless I had believed to see. That's an interesting phrase, believed to see, isn't it? So different from phrases that we use in our society today. In fact, it's almost the opposite way around. So many people would say seeing is believing. But here, David says he believed to see. Faith was required to sustain even one who had known so much victory. I believe to see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. In the land of the living, well, that could be the world. David could see the goodness of the Lord despite the evil in the world. Perhaps it's Israel. God is known there and he can hope to see his goodness there. Perhaps it's in heaven. The true land of the living and a realization of the preserving goodness of the Lord that will ultimately take us there. As Philippians reminds us, we can look beyond our present circumstances to a day yet future. As the apostle could say there, one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind, reaching forth unto those things which are before, I press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. As we think of that day yet future, that can keep us from fainting and can help us to carry on. Yet, as our final verse reminds us, that is not our portion yet. While we remain on earth, David recommends that we wait on the Lord. Keep close to God and to your duty, and be of good courage. Keep up your spirits. That's the idea here in this verse. And we can hardly read that verse, wait on the Lord, but we don't go to Isaiah 40 and there to verse 31. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint. He shall strengthen thine heart. And of course, that really at the end of the psalm, the strength of the heart, links us right back to verse 1. The Lord is the strength of my life. And so as the psalm closes, David gives us that final piece of advice, as it were, and he says, wait, I say, on the Lord. David repeats it. Wait on the Lord, he said at the beginning of verse 14, but now for emphasis, he adds, I say, as he recommends and commends us to the one who can truly strengthen our hearts. Wait, I say, on the Lord. And that really is the portion for us to wait on the Lord, to be of good courage, and he shall strengthen thine heart, the one who is our light and our salvation, the one who is the strength of our life today. So I trust that this consideration of this psalm this afternoon might have been helpful and might have been an encouragement to us as we consider it together today. Thank you very much for listening.